She's finally gone. At his billionaire wife's funeral, he called his mistress to celebrate, but no one expected what happened next. A greatest ever story for my beautiful family. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to your own family channel, Mr.SeahStories. May the Almighty cover you with endless mercy, bless your homes with unshakable peace, and crown your hearts with strength that never fades. May He grant every woman dignity that shines forever, every man wisdom that inspires generations, and every child joy so pure it lights the world. May sickness never touch you, may sorrow never hold you, and may your days shine brighter than the stars. I pray for your health, your success, and your family's happiness, that your steps always lead to blessings and your nights bring you calm. May God lift you when you fall, guide you when you are uncertain, and hold you close in His everlasting love. But my family, with respect I ask, why do some of you not like or comment? It hurts when silence falls, because every like, every word is the heartbeat that keeps this family alive. I give my love, my effort, my prayers, because you mean so much to me. If your heart is true, right, present, if your love is real, right, I am with Mr. Peter. Some women are buried before they die. I just chose to watch my funeral first, but that morning death was the furthest thing from my mind. I stood before the oil painting in the grand hallway, studying the woman I used to be. Young, radiant, draped in ivory silk, with diamonds at my throat. My wedding day. The artist had captured something in my eyes that day, something I'd spent every moment since trying to reclaim: certainty. The painting was enormous, dominating the entire wall, impossible to ignore every time I passed through this hallway. Thaddeus had commissioned it as a gift, had hired the most sought-after portrait artist in the country, had spared no expense. At the time, I'd thought it was romantic. Now I wondered if it was just another investment, another asset to appreciate in value, another piece of the carefully constructed image he was building. In the portrait, I was smiling. Not the polite smile I'd learned to wear at charity galas, but a real smile, open, unguarded, the smile of someone who believed she'd found her forever. I couldn't remember the last time I'd smiled like that. Beautiful, isn't it? I turned to find Thaddeus descending the curved staircase, impeccably dressed as always. My husband, my whole world. He kissed my cheek with practiced affection, the kind that comes from repetition rather than passion. I was just remembering that day, I said softly. You took my name, Bond. You said it meant more to you than any name your family ever gave you. And I meant it. His smile was perfect. Too perfect, perhaps, but I dismissed the thought immediately. Doubt was poison. Trust was sacred. He checked his watch. An unconscious gesture that I'd learned meant he was already mentally somewhere else. Already planning his escape from this conversation, from this moment, from me. You're leaving again? London office needs attention. 3 days, maybe 4. He adjusted his cufflinks, sterling silver engraved with my initials. A gift I'd given him, a symbol I'd believed in. You know how it is. The bigger the empire, the more fires to put out, except I didn't know how it was. Because I'd offered to come with him dozens of times, had suggested I could help, could attend meetings, could be a partner in every sense of the word. And every time, he'd found a reason why it wasn't a good idea. Too boring for me, too many tedious negotiations. He didn't want to subject me to the drudgery of his work. I'd believed him, believed I was being spared something unpleasant. Now I wondered what I was really being excluded from. I'll miss you, and I'll miss you more. He kissed me again, this time on the lips, brief and cool. Take care of yourself, Deborah, promise me. I promise. The door closed behind him with a whisper of expensive hinges. The mansion fell silent, except for the distant sound of someone working in the kitchen. Chuck, probably, the estate manager who seemed to materialize wherever work needed doing, then vanish just as quickly. I stood in the hallway for a long moment, watching the space where Thaddeus had been. The air still held a trace of his cologne, expensive and masculine. The kind of scent that turned heads at dinner parties, that made people lean in closer when he spoke. Everything about him was designed to impress, to attract, to command attention. But when had he last commanded mine? When had I last felt that flutter in my stomach when he walked into a room? When had anticipation replaced this dull acceptance of his departures? I pressed my hand against the wall, steadying myself against thoughts I didn't want to think. This was marriage. This was what happened after the honeymoon phase faded. This was normal, mature, real life, wasn't it? I wandered through rooms too large for two people, my footsteps echoing on imported marble. The east wing remained perpetually empty, guest rooms made up for visitors who never came. The dining hall with its table for 20 hosted dinner parties I'd stopped suggesting because Thaddeus always had an excuse. The music room with the grand piano I'd bought during our first year together, when I'd foolishly imagined Sunday mornings filled with his playing, my singing, our laughter blending into something beautiful. That piano sat silent now, gathering dust beneath its cover. Just like everything else I'd hoped we'd build together. Wealth had given me everything except what I truly wanted. Someone to share the silence with. But I had Thaddeus. I had love. That was enough. It had to be enough. Mrs. Bond. Chuck stood in the doorway of the library, holding a silver tray with my morning tea. Earl Grey with honey, prepared exactly as I preferred without my ever having to ask. He'd been with us for years now, a quiet presence who anticipated needs before they were spoken. Thank you, Chuck. I took the cup, noting, as I always did, how he never quite met my eyes. Respectful, I'd always thought. Proper boundaries between employer and staff. Will you be needing anything else today? Just peace and quiet, I think. Maybe I'll read in the garden. He nodded, turning to leave, then hesitated. Something flickered across his face, some internal struggle I couldn't name. Mrs. Bond, He stopped himself. Never mind. Enjoy your tea. Chuck, wait, I set down the cup. You were going to say something? Nakum, it's not my place. You've been part of this household long enough. Speak freely. He looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made my breath catch. Not the deference of a servant, not the distance of an employee. Something deeper, something that felt almost like pain, something that felt like caring, though I couldn't understand why he would care. What was I to him beyond a paycheck? Beyond someone who occasionally remembered to say thank you for the tea, for the perfectly maintained garden, for the way he anticipated needs I hadn't even articulated yet? Your husband, he began carefully, each word weighted with reluctance. Does he seem different to you lately, distant? The question landed like a slap. Heat rushed to my face, not from embarrassment but from sudden, fierce anger. How dare he? How dare this man, this employee, this stranger who happened to work in my home, question my marriage, question the one relationship I'd built my entire life around? How dare you? Mrs. Bond, I only meant, you meant to insult my husband, to plant seeds of doubt in my mind. Is that what you do? Wait for him to leave so you can poison me against him? No, I would never. Get out, my voice was ice. And Chuck, never insult my husband again. If I hear one more word against Thaddeus, you'll be looking for new employment. Do you understand? He stood frozen for a moment, and that strange pain in his eyes deepened into something that looked almost like heartbreak. But that was absurd. What did he have to break his heart over? I understand, he said quietly. Forgive me, Mrs. Bond. It won't happen again. He left without another word, and I was alone again in my beautiful prison of marble and gold. I spent the afternoon in the garden, trying to read, but finding the words swimming meaninglessly across the page. Chuck's question echoed in my mind, despite my best efforts to silence it. Distant? Thaddeus wasn't distant. He was busy, important, a man with responsibilities. But when had he last stayed home for an entire week? When had he last suggested we travel together, just the two of us? When had he last looked at me the way he did in that wedding portrait, like I was the only woman in the world worth seeing? Stop it, I whispered to myself. This is what doubt does. This is what destroys marriages. Trust. You have to trust. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, I made myself a promise. I would be a better wife. More understanding, more patient, less needy. Thaddeus had chosen me. He'd taken my name. He'd built a life with me. That meant something. That meant everything. I didn't see Chuck again that evening. He left dinner on a warmer in the dining room with a small note. Gone to handle estate matters. Will return tomorrow. I ate alone, as I did most nights, in a room designed to seat 20. The chandelier above cast prismatic light across empty chairs and unused place settings. Somewhere in London, Thaddeus was probably eating in a hotel restaurant, maybe reviewing contracts, maybe on a call, or maybe not. The thought arrived unbidden and unwelcome. I pushed it away violently, physically shaking my head as if I could dislodge it from my brain. No, I would not let Chuck's poison take root. I would not become one of those suspicious, paranoid wives who destroyed their own happiness with unfounded jealousy. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom Thaddeus and I shared, though lately he'd been sleeping in the guest room when he came home late, claiming he didn't want to wake me. Consideration, I told myself, thoughtfulness. But as I prepared for bed, I found myself opening his closet, running my hands along his suits, breathing in the scent of his cologne. And there, faint but unmistakable on the collar of a jacket he'd worn recently, was a fragrance that wasn't mine. Floral. Expensive. Foreign. My hand trembled. I pulled it back as if the fabric had burned me. Business dinner, I said aloud to the empty room. He probably hugged a colleague, a female colleague. It means nothing, nothing. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, sleep eluded me. Chuck's question played on an endless loop. Different. Distant, and beneath it a new question, quieter but more dangerous. What if he's right? I thought about the last time Thaddeus had really looked at me. Not the glances over breakfast, not the perfunctory kisses before leaving, but really looked the way he used to when we first met, like I was something precious and rare. When had that stopped? When had I become scenery in my own life? The bedroom felt enormous in the darkness. Too much space for one person, a mockery of the intimacy that should fill a marital suite. On Thaddeus's side, the sheets remained crisp and cold. He hadn't slept here in weeks. Always the guest room, always the excuses. I rolled over, pulling his pillow close, breathing in the faint scent of his cologne, trying to remember what it felt like to be held, to be wanted, to be chosen every day, not just once at an altar. No, I closed my eyes, forced my breathing to slow, commanded my mind to silence. Tomorrow I would wake up and this would all seem foolish. Tomorrow I would trust again. Tomorrow I would remember why I'd fallen in love with Thaddeus Bond. Tomorrow I would be the wife he deserved. But in the darkness, with only truth and silence as my companions, a small voice whispered what I wasn't ready to hear. What if you already are? And that's the problem. Chapter 2. The Invisible Man. Chuck Robbins had learned that invisibility was less about what you wore and more about what you let people believe. He stood in the kitchen the next morning, preparing breakfast, with hands that had once signed contracts worth billions, but now expertly arranged fresh berries and Greek yogurt on fine china. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who'd built an empire from nothing, serving breakfast to a woman who couldn't see him if he stood on fire. The kitchen was his domain in these early hours. Before the other staff arrived, before the mansion woke to its daily rhythms, here, in the silence, he could pretend he was simply a man making breakfast for the woman he loved, not a servant performing duties for an employer who looked through him like glass. He'd learned her preferences by heart. Earl Grey, never English breakfast. Honey, never sugar. Fresh berries, always organic. Greek yogurt, plain, because she said the flavored ones were too sweet, artificial, like trying to improve something that was already perfect in its simplicity. He'd listened to everything she said, catalogued every detail, built a database of her likes and dislikes that would put her actual husband to shame. Because Thaddeus didn't know these things. Thaddeus barely knew what day of the week it was unless it affected his schedule, but he hadn't come here for recognition. He'd come here for her. 3 years ago, before he'd decided to burn his old life down, Chuck had attended a charity gala. Not because he enjoyed such events, but because his board insisted someone from the company make an appearance. He'd planned to stay for exactly 1 hour, write a check, and leave. Then Deborah Bond had taken the stage. She wasn't the keynote speaker, just one of several donors thanking attendees for their generosity. But when she spoke about what wealth really meant, not the accumulation but the responsibility, not the power but the stewardship, something in Chuck's carefully constructed world had cracked open. "We spend our lives building empires," she'd said. "But what are we building them for? To look at, to guard, to pass on to children who'll squander what they didn't earn? Or are we building them to be tools, instruments of change, bridges between what is and what should be?" He'd stayed for her entire speech. Then he'd gone home and stared at his bank accounts, his properties, his stock portfolios, and felt nauseated by the pointlessness of it all. 6 months later, he'd sold everything, quietly, carefully, through shell corporations and overseas accounts, transforming his public identity into a ghost while his wealth became invisible. Then he'd done what people would have called insane. He'd applied to be Deborah Bond's estate manager. The previous one had been stealing, skimming from household accounts in amounts small enough to avoid detection. Chuck had discovered this during his research, anonymously tipped off Deborah's accountant, and waited. When the position opened, he'd interviewed with references he'd carefully manufactured and skills he'd deliberately understated. And Deborah had hired him without a second glance. Hadn't seen through the careful construction of his new identity, hadn't questioned why a man with his qualifications would want such a mundane position, hadn't wondered about the expensive watch he sometimes forgot to hide, or the way he spoke with the vocabulary of someone who'd spent years in boardrooms, not kitchens. She'd looked at the uniform and seen a servant. Had looked at his deference and seen someone beneath her notice. Had looked at everything he presented and seen exactly what he wanted her to see, nothing important. That was 3 years ago. 3 years of watching her love a man who didn't deserve to breathe the same air she breathed. 3 years of biting his tongue while Thaddeus played devoted husband in public and unfaithful snake in private. 3 years of falling deeper in love with a woman who saw him as nothing more than furniture with a pulse. He'd tried to warn her before. 6 times, in fact. Each attempt had been gentle, carefully worded, designed to plant seeds of awareness rather than accusations. Each time, she'd either ignored him or, like yesterday, shut him down with fury. The problem was trust. Deborah Bond believed in trust the way religious zealots believed in divinity. Absolutely, without evidence, sometimes against evidence. She'd built her entire marriage on that foundation, and she'd rather watch the building collapse than question the blueprint. But Chuck couldn't watch anymore, couldn't stand silent while Thaddeus prepared his exit strategy, waiting for some arbitrary timeline to expire before he claimed what he'd never earned. So he'd made a decision. If Deborah wouldn't hear his words, she'd have to see the truth. He left the breakfast tray outside her door, as he always did when she slept late, and descended to his room above the garage. From a locked drawer beneath a false bottom, he retrieved a file folder. Inside were photographs, bank statements, phone records, things that would shatter Deborah's world into pieces too small to reassemble. He'd been gathering evidence for months. Thaddeus was arrogant enough to be careless, secure in his assumption that no one paid attention to what he did. He didn't know Chuck had contacts who could trace financial transactions through 3 countries. He didn't know about the private investigators who documented his meetings with Sable Hartwell, the luxury consultant who thought she'd won a prize. He didn't know he'd been caught. Chuck spread the evidence across his small desk, studying each piece. Here was Thaddeus entering an apartment building Deborah didn't own. Here was a lease agreement under a false name. Here were credit card statements for restaurants Deborah had never visited, jewelry she'd never received, trips she'd never taken, and here were the messages, explicit, cruel, planning a future that required Deborah's removal from her own life. Just 2 more years until the prenup expires, then half of everything is ours. Ours, as if Sable had contributed anything beyond her youth and her willingness to betray another woman. Chuck's hands curled into fists, crinkling the paper. He forced himself to relax. Anger was useless. Action was everything. The question was how to make Deborah see what she'd spent 3 years refusing to acknowledge. She dismissed his concerns once already. If he pushed too hard, she'd fire him, and then he'd have no way to protect her from what was coming. But if he pushed too softly, Thaddeus would continue draining her emotionally, financially, spiritually, until nothing remained but a shell of the woman who'd given that speech, who'd made Chuck believe wealth could mean something more. He couldn't let that happen. Wouldn't let that happen, even if it meant breaking her heart to save her soul. The decision made, Chuck gathered the evidence into a manila folder and descended the stairs. Dawn was breaking over the estate, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. Beautiful and melancholic, like everything else in Deborah's carefully constructed life. He found her already awake, sitting in her office with papers scattered across her desk. She worked constantly, pouring herself into her foundation, her investments, her philanthropic projects, filling the emptiness her husband created with productivity. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the walls immediately slam into place behind her eyes. "I thought I made myself clear yesterday." "You did." Chuck closed the door behind him, something he'd never done before. "But some things are more important than job security." Her jaw tightened. "If you value your position here." "I don't." He crossed the room and placed the folder on her desk, directly on top of her paperwork. "Not compared to this." "Not compared to you?" She stared at the folder like it was a coiled snake. "What is this?" The truth you don't want to hear, but you need to see it anyway." "Chuck, I'm warning you. Open it." Something in his voice must have cut through her defenses because she fell silent. Her hand hovered over the folder, trembling slightly. She looked up at him one more time, and in her eyes he saw fear, desperate hope that he was wrong, and something else, something that recognized this moment would change everything. The morning light streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too cheerful for what was about to happen. Outside, birds were singing. Somewhere in the distance, a gardener was mowing the lawn. The world was continuing as if nothing was about to break, as if this moment wasn't about to shatter everything Deborah believed about her life. "If you're lying," she whispered, "if this is some sort of manipulation, it's not. I swear on everything I've ever valued, it's not." Her fingers touched the folder's edge, hesitated. This was the last moment of before, the last second of her old life. Once she opened this, there was no unknowing, no going back to the comfortable ignorance she'd been living in. She opened the folder, and her world began to end. Chapter 3. The Evidence. The first photograph was innocent enough. Thaddeus at a restaurant smiling at someone across the table. But the angle was wrong, intimate. The lighting was soft, romantic, and the hand reaching across to touch his was too young, too familiar, too possessive. Deborah's breath caught. She recognized that restaurant. She'd suggested they go there for their anniversary. He'd said he was too busy, had too many deadlines, couldn't possibly take an evening off, but apparently he'd found time. Just not with her. "Keep going," Chuck said softly, his voice gentle despite the violence of what he was showing her. Her hands moved mechanically, shuffling through image after image, each one a small death, each one killing another piece of the woman who'd believed in forever. Thaddeus and the woman entering a hotel. Thaddeus and the woman at an airport, boarding separately but minutes apart. Thaddeus and the woman in what looked like a private apartment, his jacket off, her shoes kicked aside, their body language screaming what words didn't need to say. The photographs fell from her fingers, scattering across the desk like evidence at a crime scene, which she supposed they were. Who is she? Sable Hartwell, luxury brand consultant. He met her at a conference 2 years ago. 2 years. Before Chuck had even started working here. Before she'd noticed anything wrong. While she'd been loving Thaddeus with blind devotion, he'd already been planning his betrayal. 2 years of lying to her face, 2 years of coming home to her bed after being in someone else's, 2 years of anniversaries and birthdays and holidays celebrated with false affection while his heart, if he even had one, belonged elsewhere. She tried to remember that conference. Had Thaddeus mentioned it? Had he come home different somehow? She searched her memory, trying to pinpoint the moment when her marriage had secretly ended while she continued living in its corpse. Nothing. She remembered nothing unusual, which meant he was good at this, practiced, skilled at compartmentalizing his life into the version he showed her and the version he lived when she wasn't looking. "These could be fabricated," she said, but her voice was hollow. She was grasping at hope, like a drowning woman reaching for driftwood that was already sinking. Look at the bank statements. She didn't want to. God, she didn't want to. But her hands moved anyway, betraying her mind's protests. Account numbers she didn't recognize. Her name forged on documents. Money transferred in amounts large enough to matter, small enough to hide in the noise of daily transactions. An apartment lease. Downtown. Expensive. In a name that wasn't his, but with his signature buried in the fine print. Credit card charges, jewelry from boutiques she'd never visited, dinners at restaurants she'd suggested they try together, always met with his excuse that he was too busy, too tired, too stressed. He hadn't been too busy. He'd already gone. With someone else. She recognized some of these restaurants, the Italian place with the Michelin star she'd bookmarked for their anniversary. He'd said it was overrated, probably not worth the hype. But apparently it was worth it for Sable. The rooftop bar she'd mentioned for their next date night. Too crowded, he'd claimed, too loud, yet the receipt showed he'd been there multiple times, each purchase including 2 expensive cocktails. Every dismissal of her suggestions had been a lie. Every maybe next time had really meant I'm taking someone else instead. Every excuse had been a cover for another betrayal. Her vision blurred. The papers swam. She felt Chuck's presence beside her, solid and real, but she couldn't look at him. Couldn't face the pity she knew she'd see there. "There's more," he said gently. "I don't want to see more." "You need to." He placed a phone transcript on top of the pile, text messages, between Thaddeus and Sable. The words were clinical at first, discussing logistics, times, places. Then they became warmer, affectionate, then explicit in ways that made Deborah's stomach turn. And then, at the bottom, dated just weeks ago. "When can we stop pretending?" Sable had written. "Soon," Thaddeus had replied. "The prenup becomes irrelevant after 5 years. Just 2 more years until it expires, then half of everything is ours. Then we don't have to hide anymore." Ours. The word stabbed through Deborah's chest like a physical blade. Not his. Ours. As if this woman, this stranger who'd stolen her husband, somehow deserved to share what Deborah had built with her own hands, her own mind, her own sacrifices. She thought about every late night she'd spent building her foundation while Thaddeus claimed to be working. Every charity gala she'd attended alone because he was supposedly closing deals. Every lonely dinner, every empty bed, every moment. She'd told herself it was fine. He was just busy. Successful people made sacrifices. But he hadn't been making sacrifices. He'd been making plans. Plans that included her money, but not her presence. Plans that required her death or departure. Plans that treated her life as an obstacle to overcome rather than a partnership to honor. "How could he do this to me?" The words came out as a whisper, barely audible even to her own ears. She wasn't asking Chuck. She was asking the universe, asking any power that might explain how love could be so completely one-sided, how trust could be so thoroughly misplaced. Chuck knelt beside her chair, bringing himself to her eye level. She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something that shocked her almost as much as the evidence. Genuine anguish, not pity, pain, as if her heartbreak was somehow his own. "Because he's a parasite," Chuck said, his voice low and fierce. "Because he saw something beautiful and decided to drain it rather than cherish it. Because he's a small man who mistakes cruelty for cleverness." I loved him. Past tense. The words felt like goodbye. "I know." I trusted him completely. "That speaks to your character, not his." Deborah laughed, a broken sound that hurt coming out. "My character? I'm a fool. A blind, stupid fool who ignored every warning, every sign, every—" She stopped, looking at Chuck with sudden, terrible understanding. "You tried to tell me." He nodded slowly. "More than once. 6 times. And I—" Shame flooded through her, hot and choking. "I yelled at you, threatened to fire you, defended the man who was betraying me while I attacked the one trying to help me. You were loyal. Loyalty isn't a flaw. It is when it's wasted." She stood abruptly, needing to move, to pace, to do anything but sit in the wreckage of her shattered illusions. "How long have you known?" "About the affair?" "A year. Maybe more." "A year?" She spun to face him. "You've known for a year and you're only showing me now." "I tried to tell you without the evidence. You wouldn't listen. So I had to gather proof you couldn't deny, couldn't explain away, couldn't dismiss as misunderstanding or coincidence. You should have forced me to look sooner." "Would you have believed me?" Chuck stood as well, his expression gentle but unflinching. "If I'd shown you this 6 months ago, would you have accepted it? Or would you have accused me of fabricating everything, of trying to destroy your marriage out of malice or jealousy?" Jealousy. The word hung between them strangely. Why would Chuck be jealous? He was an employee, a servant, nothing more. Except the way he was looking at her now suggested he was very much more, and had been for longer than she'd ever suspected. But she couldn't process that. Not now. Not with her entire life crumbling around her like a sandcastle in a storm. "What do I do?" she asked, hating the helplessness in her voice. "Do I confront him? File for divorce? Throw him out? What do you want to do?" "I want to know the truth. Not just the evidence of what he's done, but why. I want to hear him say it. I want to watch his face when he tells me I meant nothing, when he admits he was only waiting for the right time to cash out." "Then we give you that chance." "How?" Chuck moved closer, and she realized for the first time how tall he was, how broad his shoulders were beneath the simple clothing he always wore. There was strength in him, not just physical, but something deeper, resolve, certainty, the kind of presence that made you feel safer just knowing he was near. Had he always been like this? Had she simply never noticed? Or had grief and betrayal somehow sharpened her perception, made her see things she'd been blind to before? "I have an idea," he said, "but it's dangerous, and once we start, there's no going back. Tell me." "We make him think he's won." Deborah frowned, not understanding. "Won what?" "Everything." Chuck's eyes held hers, dark and intense. "We fake your death." The words landed like a bomb in the quiet office. For a long moment, Deborah couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't process what she'd just heard. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence, each second marking the space between her old understanding of the world and this new, strange possibility. "You want me to pretend to die?" "I want you to see his true face, not the one he shows you, the one he shows when he thinks no one's watching, the one he shares with her. That's insane. Probably. It's impossible. Actually, it's not. Difficult, yes. Complicated, yes. But not impossible. Deborah sank back into her chair, her mind racing. Fake her death. Stage some kind of accident or illness. Make Thaddeus believe she was gone. And then what? Watch him grieve? Or watch him celebrate? The thought made her physically ill. But beneath the nausea was something else. Something cold and hard and sharp. Curiosity. Need. The burning desire to know exactly what kind of man she'd given her heart to see without filters or illusions what he really felt about her. I must see his true face myself, she said slowly, the words forming a resolution that felt like steel in her chest. Chuck nodded. Then let me help you do it. Why? She looked up at him, searching his face for answers. Why do you care this much? Why go to these lengths for your employer? Because you're not just my employer, Chuck said simply. And I think part of you has always known that. Before she could respond, before she could question what he meant or why his words made her heart stutter strangely in her chest, he continued, I need a day to make arrangements. Can you act normal for that long? Can you pretend nothing's changed when Thaddeus calls tonight? Could she? Could she hear his voice dripping false affection and not scream the truth at him? Could she maintain the illusion of her ignorance for even one more conversation? She thought of that wedding portrait in the hallway, of the woman she'd been, of the trust she'd believed was unbreakable. That woman was dead already, killed by evidence in a manila folder. What was left was someone harder, colder, angrier, someone capable of pretending. Yes, she said, I can do it. Then we start tomorrow. Chuck moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Mrs. Bond. Deborah, she corrected. If we're going to do this, if we're going to burn my life down, to see what rises from the ashes, you should call me Deborah. He smiled, and it transformed his face from pleasant to extraordinary. Deborah, then. Try to sleep tonight. Tomorrow, everything changes. He left her alone with the evidence spread across her desk, proof of betrayal captured in ink and pixels. Deborah gathered the photographs carefully, studying each one, as if memorizing details for a test she couldn't afford to fail. In one image, Thaddeus was laughing at something Sable said, his head thrown back, joy radiating from every line of his body. Deborah couldn't remember the last time he'd laughed like that with her, couldn't remember when she'd stopped being the source of his happiness and become merely the source of his stability. Her phone buzzed. A text message from Thaddeus. London is boring without you. Miss your face. Home soon. She stared at the words, at the casual lie delivered with such practiced ease, and felt something fundamental shift inside her. Love dying, trust shattering. But in their place, rising like a dark phoenix, was something new. Rage. And the unshakable determination to show Thaddeus Bond exactly what happened when you underestimated the woman foolish enough to love you. She typed back, Miss you too. Be safe, I'll be waiting. Every word a lie, every word a weapon. Let him think she was still blind. Let him think he'd won. Tomorrow they'd see who was really playing the longer game. Chapter 4. The Breaking. Dawn came too quickly and too slowly. Deborah had spent the night suspended between fury and grief, pacing her bedroom while her mind replayed every moment of her marriage through this new, terrible lens of truth. How had she missed it? How had she been so blind? She'd prided herself on being perceptive, on reading people, on understanding motivations. She'd built a fortune on the ability to see through false promises and empty flattery. Yet in her own home, in her own bed, she'd been completely fooled, or had she? That was the question that haunted her through the dark hours. Had she really been fooled, or had she simply chosen not to see? How many times had she noticed something off, something wrong, and immediately explained it away? How many red flags had she painted green in her mind because acknowledging them would mean facing a truth too painful to bear? The evidence Chuck showed her hadn't revealed anything new. It had simply made undeniable what some part of her had always known. And that realization was almost worse than the betrayal itself. She'd been complicit in her own deception. She'd helped Thaddeus fool her by refusing to ask the questions that would have shattered her comfortable illusions. At first light, she heard movement downstairs. Chuck, arriving as he always did. But today the sound of his footsteps felt different, significant. Today he wasn't just her estate manager. He was her co-conspirator in a plan so audacious it bordered on madness. She descended the stairs still wearing yesterday's clothes, her hair uncombed, her face bare. Chuck was in the kitchen, preparing coffee with the same quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He looked up when she entered and didn't comment on her appearance, for which she was grateful. "Did you sleep?" "No." She accepted the coffee cup he offered, wrapping both hands around it for warmth she didn't really need. "Did you?" "No." They stood in silence for a moment, two people on the edge of something irreversible, gathering courage for the jump. "Tell me how this works," Deborah said finally. "Tell me every detail. I need to understand what I'm agreeing to." Chuck set down his own cup and pulled out his phone, scrolling through notes. "First, we need a believable cause of death. Something sudden but not suspicious. Heart failure is the obvious choice. And the doctor? I know someone who lost his license over a technicality. Brilliant physician. But he made an enemy of the wrong hospital administrator. He owes me a favor. How does an estate manager know disgraced doctors?" Chuck looked at her steadily, and in that moment she saw something flicker across his face. A decision being made. A wall coming down. I'll explain that later. What matters now is that he'll sign whatever paperwork we need. Death certificate, medical reports, everything official enough to satisfy investigation. And if someone looks too closely... We staged the death somewhere remote. That cabin property you own upstate. The one Thaddeus always called rustic and refused to visit. Deborah nodded slowly. She'd bought that cabin years ago as a retreat. Thaddeus had gone once, complained about the lack of cell service, and never returned. She'd gone alone several times since, finding peace in the isolation. Finding herself in the silence he couldn't tolerate. Now that cabin would become her tomb. At least symbolically, at least temporarily. I could say I'm going there for a few days. To clear my head. Perfect. You drive up, I follow separately. Once we're there, I make the call to emergency services. The doctor arrives, pronounces you dead, and we transport your body to a funeral home I've already contacted. Chuck. Deborah set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. Who are you? Really? Because estate managers don't have networks of compromised professionals at their disposal. He met her gaze steadily. I'm someone who had a different life before this one. Someone who learned that money buys almost anything, including loyalty, silence, and second chances for people society has discarded. That's not an answer. It's the only answer you're getting right now. Do you trust me? I trusted my husband. Look how that worked out. Fair point. Chuck leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. Then don't trust me. Trust the evidence. Trust your own instincts. Trust the fact that I've had 3 years to hurt you, manipulate you, or steal from you, and I've done nothing but try to protect you. Deborah studied him. This man she'd barely noticed for so long, who now seemed to be the only solid thing in a world built on lies. There was something in his eyes, something beyond competence or strategy. Real emotion, real investment, real feeling. All right, she said, I trust you. Not because I'm wise, but because I'm desperate, and you're the only person who hasn't lied to me lately. I'll take it. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Now the timeline. You leave for the cabin today. Thaddeus is in London until tomorrow night. That gives us time to stage everything and make the official calls while he's unreachable. By the time he lands, you'll already be officially dead. And then we watch, we record. We document everything he does, every one he calls, every mask he drops when he thinks no one's looking. We give him enough rope to hang himself with, and then... Chuck paused, his expression hardening. Then you come back from the dead and take everything he thought he'd won. It was cruel. It was manipulative. It was theatrical in a way that should have felt juvenile. But the part of Deborah that had shattered last night, that had been crushed under the weight of betrayal and humiliation, thought it was perfect. "When do I leave?" "Within the hour." "Pack light, like you're only going for a few days. Leave your phone here. Don't tell anyone where you're going. I need to text Thaddeus. He'll expect it. Tell him you're feeling overwhelmed, that you need some time alone to think. Be vague, but emotional enough that he won't push." The words stung because they were almost certainly true. How many times had she suggested they take a trip together, only to be met with excuses? How many evenings had she proposed they stay in and talk, only to watch him retreat to his office? He'd been pulling away for years. She'd just been too blind to notice. "I should write a will," Deborah said suddenly. "If I'm dying, I'd want my affairs in order." "Already done." Chuck pulled a folder from his bag. "Everything goes to your foundation, with specific bequests to your sister and key employees. Thaddeus gets nothing. Nothing! The prenup stipulates a settlement if the marriage ends before 5 years, but in the event of your death, he gets a flat sum. Generous, but nowhere near half your estate." Deborah took the document, scanning the legal language that Chuck had somehow rendered in perfect form. "You've thought of everything. I've had a long time to plan. I just hoped I'd never have to implement it." She looked up from the pages. How long have you been preparing for this?" "Since the 2nd month I worked here. I saw the signs even then. The way he looked at you when you weren't watching. The way he'd smile at his phone and hide the screen. I knew eventually he'd break your heart, or I'd have to help you break his. You've been protecting me all this time." "Yes." "Why?" The question hung between them, simple but weighted with complexity. Chuck pushed away from the counter, moving to the window that overlooked the garden where Deborah spent her lonely afternoons. "Because 3 years ago I went to a gala I didn't want to attend. But then you gave a speech about what wealth really means, about responsibility and stewardship and building bridges between what is and what should be. And something in your words reached through every defense I'd built and reminded me that life is supposed to mean something beyond accumulation." He turned back to face her. "You changed how I saw everything. My priorities, my purpose, my understanding of what matters. And when I learned you'd married someone who saw you as an asset rather than a miracle, I couldn't just walk away. So I found a way to stay close, to watch over you, to be ready for the day you'd finally see what I saw." Deborah felt something shift in her chest, some tectonic plate of emotion grinding against another. "And what do you see?" "Someone extraordinary, who's been convinced she's ordinary. Someone generous who's been taken advantage of. Someone who deserves so much more than she's been given." Tears threatened, but she forced them back. She couldn't afford to break, not yet. Not until this was finished and Thaddeus had shown his true face to the world. "I need to pack," she said, her voice rough. "I'll get the car ready." She started toward the stairs, then stopped. "Chuck, thank you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself." He smiled. "Deborah, I've always seen you. From the very beginning, I've always seen you." An hour later, she was in her car, driving north toward the cabin with a small overnight bag. The morning was clear, the highway mostly empty. Under different circumstances, she might have enjoyed the drive, the freedom of motion, the promise of solitude. But today, every mile felt like driving toward her own funeral, which she supposed she was. Her phone buzzed. A text from Chuck: "Drive safe. I'm an hour behind you. Everything is in motion. Everything is in motion." The words felt prophetic, like crossing a threshold from which there was no return. She was dying today, or pretending to, and tomorrow the world would believe Deborah Bond was gone. She wondered how Thaddeus would react when he got the news. Would he be shocked? Devastated? Would he put on a good show? Or would he smile? The thought made her grip the steering wheel harder. She wouldn't know until she saw it herself. Wouldn't believe the depth of his betrayal until she witnessed it firsthand. Let him think she was dead. Let him think he'd won. She'd show him what resurrection looked like. The cabin appeared around a curve in the road, exactly as she remembered. Small, rustic, surrounded by trees turning gold with autumn. A place of peace that was about to become the stage for an elaborate deception. She parked and sat for a moment, looking at the structure that would serve as her symbolic tomb. This was it, the point of no return. Deborah picked up her phone and typed a message to Chuck. "I'm here. Let's do this." His response came immediately. 30 minutes out. Don't answer the door until you hear our code phrase, which is, "Some women are buried before they die." She laughed despite everything. It was perfect, dramatic and fitting and absolutely true. Some women were buried before they die, but Deborah Bond was about to dig herself out and show the world what happened when you underestimated a woman's capacity for resurrection. Chapter 5. The Resurrection Plan. Chuck arrived exactly when he said he would, accompanied by 2 men Deborah didn't recognize. One was older, gray-haired, carrying a leather medical bag. The doctor. The other was younger, dressed in dark clothing, with careful posture. The funeral director. "Deborah Bond," Chuck said formally. "Meet Dr. Emmett Thorne and Leonard Vale." Neither man offered to shake her hand. They simply nodded, professional and distant. "Let's be clear," Dr. Thorne said, his voice carrying crisp authority. "What you're asking me to do violates every ethical guideline of my former profession. I'm only doing this because Chuck saved my daughter's life when the medical community turned its back on us. But I need your word that this stays between us forever." "You have it," Deborah said, "and you understand the risks. If anyone discovers this deception, it's fraud. We'd all face serious consequences." "I understand. Why are you doing this?" The question came from Leonard Vale. "Why fake your death instead of just divorcing him?" "Because I need to see his true face. I need to know exactly who he is when he thinks no one's watching. And I need the world to see it too." Leonard nodded slowly. "Fair enough. I've buried too many people who stayed in marriages that killed them slowly. Better to die and come back than to fade away wondering." They spent the next hour planning every detail. The timeline, the phone calls, the paperwork, the transportation of Deborah's body to the funeral home, the viewing arrangements, the burial, which would be an empty casket. "What about my sister?" Deborah asked. "Lorraine will want to see me. Tell her you're being cremated," Chuck suggested. "Your last wishes, already documented." It felt wrong lying to Lorraine, but bringing her into this conspiracy felt too dangerous. Better to apologize later than risk the truth coming out too soon. Dr. Thorne prepared the official documents with meticulous care. "Heart failure secondary to acute stress," he read aloud. "Sudden but not unexpected. No autopsy required. And if someone questions it?" Deborah asked. "They won't. My signature still carries weight. Most people don't question death when it's documented properly." Leonard Vale produced a phone and made a call. "This is Vale. I need emergency transport from the Adler cabin upstate. Female deceased, natural causes. Family requesting private arrangements." He listened. "Yes, everything's in order. We'll be there in 3 hours." He hung up and looked at Deborah. "That's your funeral home. They're expecting a body. What do I do now?" Deborah asked, suddenly feeling unmoored. "Now," Chuck said, "you disappear. I have an apartment across town. You'll stay there while we handle everything. No phone calls, no internet, nothing that could leave a digital footprint." "How long?" "A week, maybe less, until Thaddeus shows his true face and we have enough documentation to destroy him." A week in hiding. A week of watching her own death play out from the shadows. And then, Chuck's expression hardened. "Then you come back, and we make sure everyone sees exactly what he did." Dr. Thorne packed his bag. "I'll file the death certificate today. It'll be in the system by tonight." "Thank you," Deborah said. "I know this isn't easy." "Nothing worth doing is easy," he replied. "Sometimes the only way to expose a liar is to become one yourself, just long enough to prove the truth." After they left, Chuck and Deborah locked up the cabin carefully. She took one last look at the place that had been her refuge, now transformed into the scene of her symbolic death. The drive back to the city was quiet. Chuck drove while Deborah watched the world blur past. Everything looked different now. more real somehow, more vivid, as if dying even in pretense had awakened senses she didn't know she possessed. "What happens after?" she asked suddenly. "After we expose Thaddeus, what happens to me?" "Whatever you want. You rebuild, you recover. You become whoever you want to be. And you? What happens to you?" He kept his eyes on the road. "That depends on you. On me? And on whether you want me to stay or go once this is finished. I already see you as more than an estate manager." "Do you?" Now he glanced at her briefly. "Or are you just grateful?" She didn't have an answer, didn't know what she felt beyond the immediate chaos. But there was something in the way Chuck spoke that suggested he'd been hurt before. "Ask me again in a week," she said finally, "when this is over." "Ask me again then." They arrived at the apartment building as the sun began setting. The building was elegant, but not ostentatious. Chuck's apartment was on the top floor. When he unlocked the door, Deborah stepped into a space that immediately confused her understanding of who Chuck Robbins was. The furniture was expensive. Original artwork on the walls. Books everywhere, thousands of them. A grand piano in the corner. "Estate managers don't live like this," she said slowly. "No," Chuck agreed. "They don't. Who are you?" He set down her bag and moved to the window. Someone who had everything and realized it meant nothing. Someone who sold it all and tried to find meaning in service. Someone who fell in love with a woman who couldn't see him. "Chuck, my real name is Charles Remington Robbins. I founded a software company, sold it for an amount that would make your fortune look modest, and spent a decade being miserable. Then I heard you speak at that gala, and you said wealth without purpose is just expensive loneliness. And I realized that's exactly what I'd become. So I liquidated everything and became someone new. Someone who might actually matter." Deborah sank onto the piano bench. "You're a billionaire." "Technically, yes. And I chose to be close to you. For 3 years. For 3 years. That's insane." "Probably." He turned from the window. "But no more insane than faking your death. We're both a little mad, Deborah. At least we're mad together." She laughed despite everything. "He was right. What happens now?" she asked. "Now I call your husband. I tell him you're dead. And we watch what kind of man he becomes." Chuck pulled out his phone, and Deborah's heart started racing. This was it. "Speakerphone," she said. "I want to hear his voice." Chuck nodded and dialed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then Thaddeus answered, his voice annoyed. "Chuck, this better be important. Mr. Bond." Chuck's voice was perfectly pitched with grief and shock. "I'm so sorry to disturb you, but there's been a terrible incident." A pause. "What kind of incident?" "It's your wife, sir, Mrs. Bond. I'm so sorry." "She's gone." Silence. Long enough that Deborah wondered if the call had dropped. Then, "Gone? What do you mean, gone?" "She died, sir." "This afternoon. Art failure. It was sudden." Another pause. Deborah held her breath, waiting. "How did this happen?" Thaddeus asked. No tears, no shock. Just questions. She'd gone to the cabin upstate. Said she needed time alone. I checked on her this afternoon and found her collapsed. The paramedics couldn't revive her. Did anyone else see? Is there documentation? Documentation, not grief. Just concern about paperwork. Yes, sir. Dr. Thorne was on site, pronounced her deceased, filed all necessary reports. Good, that's good. A breath. Have you contacted anyone else? Not yet, sir. I thought you should know first. Right, yes. Of course. Thaddeus's voice shifted slightly. This is terrible news. Absolutely terrible. I'll catch the next flight home. Don't contact anyone until I return. Of course, sir. And Chuck, make sure everything is in order. The last thing we need is questions. The last thing we need is questions. Not tears, not horror, just logistics. I understand, sir. I'll be home by morning. The call ended. Deborah sat frozen, staring at the phone, as if it were a weapon. You heard him, Chuck said softly. I heard him. What are you thinking? She looked up. I'm thinking I married a monster, and I'm thinking that monsters need to be seen for what they are. They do. So let's show him to the world. Let's watch him celebrate my death. And then her voice turned to steel. Then I'm going to rise from the dead and take everything. Chuck smiled. Now you're talking resurrection. Now I'm talking revenge. Chapter 6. The Celebration Thaddeus. Bond closed his hotel room door and allowed himself exactly 4 minutes to process the news. His wife was dead. Deborah, the woman whose name had become his meal ticket, whose fortune had bankrolled his comfort, whose trust had been laughably easy to exploit, gone. He paced the expensive carpet, mind racing through implications and opportunities. No more pretending, no more performance, no more careful management of two separate lives that threatened to collide every time his phone buzzed with a message he had to hide. Freedom tasted sweet, even in this sterile hotel room, thousands of miles from where her body supposedly lay cooling. The prenup. He'd have to check the exact wording, but he remembered something about a settlement. Not half her fortune, which had been his ultimate goal, the prize he'd been waiting for, but enough, more than enough to start over with Sable, to build the life he'd been planning in stolen moments and secret conversations. And more importantly, freedom. No more pretending to care about her charity work. No more hiding his phone. No more scheduling his affair around her calendar. Sable, God, he needed to call her. But first, he needed to practice the face he'd wear tomorrow when he returned home to play grieving widower. He stood before the hotel mirror, forcing his features into something resembling sorrow. Too much? Not enough? He tried different variations. The stoic hero bearing loss with dignity. The broken man barely holding himself together. The loving husband destroyed by unexpected tragedy. Which one would be most believable? Which one would elicit the most sympathy? Which one would make people less likely to question the financial details of the will? He settled on something in the middle. Grief contained but visible. Sorrow acknowledged but not theatrical. The kind of performance that would let him function, attend to necessary arrangements, but would excuse any lapses in attention or emotion. Perfect. His phone buzzed. Sable, meeting running late. Miss you. He smiled. She had no idea how much better things were about to get. Change of plans, he typed back. Big news. Call you in 10. He spent those 10 minutes composing himself, building the narrative. They'd been happy. He'd loved her. This was unexpected, tragic, devastating. Finally, he called Sable. She answered immediately. Hey, baby, what's the big news? She's finally gone. Silence. Then carefully. Gone. What do you mean, gone? A dead heart failure. This afternoon. It's over, Sable. It's finally over. He heard her sharp intake of breath. You're serious? Completely. The estate manager called me an hour ago. She went to that cabin, died alone up there. Almost poetic, really. Thaddeus, her voice dropped to a whisper. Are you okay? I'm fantastic. We're fantastic. Do you know what this means? Tell me. Freedom, money, the ability to stop hiding. Tonight we celebrate. I'll catch a red eye back tomorrow, but tonight we toast to the future. Should we really celebrate? Your wife just died. My wife, he said coldly, was a business arrangement that just concluded favorably. Now meet me at our place. I'm ordering champagne. We've earned it. What Thaddeus didn't know was that Chuck had prepared for this moment. The secret apartment downtown had been transformed into a recording studio. Cameras in air vents, microphones in light fixtures, every angle covered, every word captured, and Chuck, sitting in his real apartment with Deborah beside him, watched the whole scene unfold on a laptop screen. Deborah's face was stone as she heard her husband call her death favorable, as she watched him practice grief like a script, as she saw him smile with genuine happiness. Are you all right? Chuck asked quietly. No, she said, but I will be. Keep recording. An hour later, Sable Hartwell arrived at the apartment in red silk and expensive perfume. She carried champagne. Thaddeus pulled her into an embrace, kissing her with intensity he'd never shown his wife. We did it, he breathed against her neck. We actually did it. You didn't do anything, Sable laughed. She died all on her own. We just got lucky. Luck, fate, I don't care what we call it. She's gone and we're here. They opened the champagne with celebratory flourish. To freedom, Thaddeus raised his glass. To the future, Sable clinked hers against his. To never having to pretend again. In Chuck's apartment, Deborah stood and walked to the window. She couldn't watch anymore. They keep recording, she said. I want every word. On the laptop screen, Thaddeus was refilling his glass. She was so trusting, Sable said. Like a child, really. You'd tell her you were working late and she'd just believe you. That's what made it so easy, Thaddeus agreed. She thought trust was a virtue. I thought it was a weakness to exploit. Did you ever love her? Even a little. He considered the question. I loved what she represented. Money, status, security. But her? No, she was exhausting with all that loyalty nonsense. Always wanting to connect. It was like being married to a motivational poster, Sable laughed. That's cruel, but accurate. What about the estate manager? Is he going to be a problem? Please. He's a servant who knows his place. At this, Chuck's jaw tightened. Deborah turned to look at him. He doesn't know you at all, does he? No, Chuck said quietly. He never bothered to see past the uniform. On screen, Thaddeus was pouring a third glass. How much do you think you'll get from the will? Sable asked. Maybe 5 million? Her lawyers tried to protect her, but they couldn't have predicted this. 5 million. Sable's eyes gleamed. We could do a lot with 5 million. We could do everything. Europe, that villa you wanted. No more hiding. When's the funeral? Probably within a few days. I'll have to play devastated husband, at least until the will is settled. After that, who cares what people think? How long before we can be seen together? 6 months, maybe. A respectable mourning period. Then we'll announce our relationship as something new. People love that story. Widower finding love again? You've thought about this, of course. I've been planning this exit strategy since before we met. I just needed her to die or become inconvenient enough to divorce. Death is neater. Deborah turned away from the window. I want to walk in there right now. Not yet, Chuck said firmly. We need more. We need to destroy him completely. How much more can there be? Plenty. By the time we're done, he won't just lose his settlement. He'll lose everything. On screen, Thaddeus had moved to the window with champagne in hand. You know what the best part is, he said to Sable. She died thinking I loved her. Died believing in us. She never knew. Never suspected. Never realized she was sleeping next to someone counting days until he could cash out. That seems almost sad, Sable said, though her tone suggested she didn't really think so. Sad for her, maybe. Lucky for us. Can you imagine if she'd figured it out? This way is so much cleaner. He raised his glass to the city. Thank you, Deborah, for being trusting enough to die with illusions intact. It really is the best gift you ever gave me. Chuck closed the laptop before Deborah could hear more. She was shaking. That's enough for tonight, he said. You've seen what you needed to see. Now we start phase 2, which is, tomorrow he comes home. Tomorrow your funeral arrangements begin. And tomorrow we start inviting the right people to witness his performance. Who? Your sister Lorraine. Board members from your foundation. Your lawyer. A few journalists. We're going to pack your funeral with people who actually loved you. And we're going to document the contrast. Deborah nodded slowly. And then? Then we wait, we watch. We gather evidence. And when we have everything, when his guard is down, then I come back. Deborah finished. Exactly. She moved to the couch, suddenly exhausted. Chuck sat beside her, keeping respectful distance but present. Chuck, she said quietly. Yes? Thank you. For seeing him clearly when I couldn't. You don't need to thank me. I do. Because you're risking everything for this. He was quiet for a long moment. Because watching someone I love be hurt by someone unworthy is worse than any risk. Because some things are worth fighting for. Because you deserve to know the truth. Someone you love, Deborah repeated softly. Yes. How long? Since the gala. Since your speech. Since I realized that everything I'd been chasing was meaningless. She reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. It felt strange, intimate in a way nothing had felt in years. Not passionate, not desperate. Just real. Ask me again in a week, she whispered. When this is over. Ask me again then who I see when I look at you. I will, Chuck promised. And whatever answer you give, I'll accept it. They sat in silence as the city lights glowed beyond the window. As somewhere across town, Thaddeus and Sable celebrated a death that hadn't happened. Tomorrow, Deborah Bond's funeral would begin, but tonight, she was simply a woman learning that resurrection required dying first. Chapter 7. Mourning the Living. The funeral home looked exactly as Deborah remembered. Elegant without being ostentatious, somber without being oppressive. The kind of place where grief was respected, but contained within tasteful walls and indirect lighting. She sat in the back of Chuck's car across the street, wearing a dark wig and sunglasses. From this distance, she could see people arriving in black clothing, their faces somber. Some she recognized, some she didn't, all believing they were here to mourn her death. The parking lot filled slowly, black cars depositing passengers dressed in black, a river of mourning flowing toward the building where her empty casket waited. Deborah watched each arrival, cataloging who came, who cried, who looked genuinely devastated versus who seemed to be performing appropriate grief for an audience. Mrs. Chen from the foundation board arrived early, her elderly frame bent with sorrow. She'd known Deborah's mother, had been a mentor when Deborah first started her philanthropic work. Her grief was real, etched into every line of her face. Watching her shuffle toward the entrance, leaning heavily on her cane, Deborah felt guilt twist in her stomach. But then she saw the Rothsteins, distant cousins who'd never bothered to visit but always appeared when her name was in the papers. They looked appropriately somber, but their eyes scanned the crowd, assessing who else had come, who was important enough to network with even at a funeral. Vultures in expensive suits. "Your sister just arrived," Chuck said quietly. Deborah leaned forward, spotting Lorraine climbing out of a black sedan. Her sister's face was blotchy and red, clearly from hours of crying. Genuine grief, raw and painful. "I should go to her," she whispered. "You can't, not yet. She thinks I'm dead, Chuck. She's in there mourning me." "I know, and I'm sorry, but if we break now, this was all for nothing." Deborah sat back, closing her eyes. This was harder than she'd anticipated, watching real grief from people who actually cared about her. "He's here," Chuck said. Her eyes snapped open. A black limousine had pulled up, and Thaddeus emerged wearing an expensive suit and practiced devastation. He moved slowly, as if grief weighed down his limbs, accepted condolences with appropriate nods, and what looked like restrained tears. "He's good," Chuck observed. "If I didn't know better, I'd believe he was suffering. He's always been good at performing." They watched as Thaddeus entered the funeral home, disappearing where Deborah's empty casket waited. "How long do we wait?" she asked. "Until the viewing ends. Until everyone who matters has seen him play devoted husband. Then we move to phase 3. More people arrived. Board members from her foundation, colleagues, friends she hadn't seen in years. All of them real. All of them grieving. And then the journalists began filtering in. See the woman in the grey suit? Investigative reporter. And the man with the notebook? He writes about corruption. They're here because I invited them, told them there was a story developing. What kind of story? I didn't specify. Just suggested they should attend and wait. Reporters love a mystery. An hour passed, then 2. People slowly filtered out, dabbing at eyes, embracing each other, speaking in hushed tones. Lorraine emerged last, supported by a friend. She looked shattered, barely able to walk. "I can't watch this," Deborah said, turning away. "You're not a coward. You're being strategic. Is there a difference? Because right now it feels like I'm just cruel." Chuck turned to face her. "Your sister's pain is real, but it's temporary. In a few days she'll learn you're alive. What's not temporary is what Thaddeus has been doing. If we stop now, he gets away with it. He gets to keep destroying people." Deborah knew he was right. Hated it, but knew it. "All right," she said finally. "We continue. But the moment we have enough, we end it." "Agreed." They followed Thaddeus from the funeral home to the estate. Once inside the mansion, once he believed himself alone, the transformation was immediate. Caught on security cameras, Thaddeus straightened, checked his watch, and smiled. 4 hours, he muttered to himself. 4 hours of playing devastated widower. I deserve a medal. He poured himself a drink from the bar in Deborah's study. His phone rang. Sable. Hey, baby, he answered, his voice warm. Gone was the grief-stricken tone. Yeah, it's over. God, what a performance. I think I actually made myself tear up once. He listened, laughing. No, the casket was closed. I insisted on cremation. No body, no autopsy, no questions. Everything's moving exactly as planned. A pause. Her sister was a mess, but that works for us. The more devastated the family is, the less likely they'll question anything. Deborah's hands clenched into fists. He was using Lorraine's pain as cover. Tomorrow the will reading, Thaddeus continued. That's when we'll know exactly what I'm getting. But whatever it is, it's ours, he laughed. Yeah, I'll come by later. Give me a few hours, then I'll celebrate properly with you. He hung up and raised his glass. To you, Deborah, for being too trusting, too blind, and too conveniently dead. Enough, Chuck said, closing the laptop. We have what we need from today. Tomorrow's the will reading. Why is that important? Because that's when he'll learn what he's actually getting. And when he realizes it's not half your fortune, he's going to be angry. Angry enough to drop his guard completely. The will, Deborah said slowly. You structured it to enrage him. To expose him, Chuck corrected. People show their true nature when things don't go their way. The next day, Deborah watched from Chuck's apartment as her lawyer, her accountant, her sister, and Thaddeus gathered. The reading was being live-streamed to Chuck's laptop. The lawyer began reading. Standard legal language about assets and distributions. Money to the foundation. Bequests to staff and charities. A generous sum to Lorraine. And then, finally, the clause about Thaddeus. To my husband, Thaddeus Bond, I leave the sum of $5 million to be distributed over 5 years in annual installments. The lawyer continued, but Deborah was watching Thaddeus's face. Watching the calculation happen behind his eyes. 5 million, not half, not even close. His jaw tightened. His hands gripped the armrests. For just a moment, before he caught himself, fury flashed across his features. Then the mask slammed back into place. Bereaved husband, grateful for whatever his beloved wife had left him. But the damage was done. The camera had caught it. He's going to break, Chuck said with certainty. Tonight, maybe tomorrow. But soon. They didn't have to wait long. That evening, Thaddeus stormed into the secret apartment where Sable was waiting, his performance completely abandoned. $5 million, he snarled, throwing his jacket across the room. $5 million over 5 years. Do you know what that is? Nothing. That's nothing compared to what I deserved. Sable stood from the couch, alarmed. It's still a lot of money. It's an insult. I spent 5 years pretending to love that woman. 5 years of listening to her philosophize. 5 years of playing devoted husband. And for what? $1 million a year. Thaddeus, calm down. Don't tell me to calm down. She played me. Even in death, she played me. He poured himself whiskey, his hands shaking with rage. We can't even access most of it yet. Just have to sit here and wait for my annual allowance like a child. So what do we do? I don't know. Maybe contest the will? But that's risky. Could make me look like the villain. You think? He glared at her. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. Just, maybe you should think about how this looks. Your wife just died and you're angry about money. I don't care about image. I care about what I was promised. This was supposed to be our ticket. Sable's expression hardened. We? So now we're suddenly partners when things don't work out. They stared at each other, the first cracks showing in their alliance. I need to think, Thaddeus said finally. Need to figure out if there's any way to contest this. Good luck with that. He left, slamming the door. Sable remained alone, pulled out her phone and made a call. Hey, it's me, she said. Yeah, about that situation. It's not working out as planned. The money's not there. A pause. I'm thinking maybe it's time to distance myself. I don't want to go down with this ship. She listened. No, I'm not abandoning him completely. Just hedging my bets. If this blows up, I need to be able to claim I was deceived too. That plays better than conspiring gold digger. Deborah laughed despite everything. She's already planning her exit strategy. Honor among thieves only lasts as long as there's treasure to steal, Chuck observed. How much longer? Deborah asked. One more piece. The financial records. Tomorrow we'll have the full audit, showing exactly how much he's stolen. Once we have that, once we can prove fraud, then I come back. Then you come back. And you don't just expose him. You destroy him. Deborah stood, moving to the window. Somewhere out there, people still believe she was dead. Tomorrow, that would change. Tomorrow, the truth would begin its work. And the day after, Deborah Bond would rise from the dead. Chapter 8. The Trap Springs. The financial audit arrived at dawn in a sealed envelope. Deborah watched as Chuck opened it, spreading documents across the dining table. Start from the beginning, she said. Show me everything. Chuck organized the papers chronologically. 6 months after you married, Thaddeus opened 3 accounts under shell corporations. Small transfers at first. 5,000 here, 10,000 there. Amounts small enough to hide. He pointed to a spreadsheet. But they added up. Over 5 years, he moved almost $20 million. Money you thought was going to investments, charitable donations. All lies, all theft, 20 million. After everything else, theft seemed almost predictable. Can we prove it? She asked. Yes, your accountant has been meticulous. Every transfer tracked, every false invoice documented, every forged signature highlighted. When this goes to court, Thaddeus won't be able to explain any of it. Good. Chuck gathered the papers carefully. There's more. He's been using your name to secure loans, property purchases that will default. He's built a financial house of cards, so he's not just a thief. He's a criminal. Yes, which means when you come back, this won't just be about divorce. This will be about prosecution. Prison time? Deborah paced the apartment. When do we do it? When do I come back? Tonight. There's an event, a gathering he's hosting at that apartment. But I've invited certain guests. Your sister, your board members, those journalists, people who need to see. What will they see? Him, celebrating with Sable, toasting your death, sharing details of how he deceived you. Everything captured on video, everything witnessed by people whose testimony will matter. And then, Chuck smiled, fierce. Then you walk through that door, alive, and you show him what resurrection looks like. They spent the day preparing. Chuck sent carefully worded invitations promising information about Deborah's estate, irregularities requiring immediate attention. Board members accepted immediately. The journalists smelled a story. Lorraine, confused but trusting, agreed to come. Won't Thaddeus question why all these people are showing up? Deborah asked. He won't be there when they arrive. He thinks he's meeting Sable privately. By the time he walks in, everyone will already be inside, hidden, watching. As evening approached, Deborah dressed carefully. White, not black. The color of rebirth, not mourning. Her real hair, not the wig. Her face bare. She looked like herself, but somehow more. Stronger, clearer. Ready? Chuck asked. I've been dead for a week. I'm more than ready to be alive again. They arrived at the apartment building separately. Chuck went in first, positioning the guests in the master bedroom, where a two-way mirror offered a perfect view of the living room. One by one they gathered. Lorraine, confused and worried. The board members, increasingly concerned. The journalists, cameras ready. What's happening? Lorraine whispered to Chuck, Why are we here? Trust me, he said gently. Everything will make sense soon. And your sister is fine. Fine. She's dead. We buried her. Just watch. Please. Thaddeus arrived right on time, letting himself in with his key. Sable was already there, music playing, champagne chilling. She'd worn the red dress he loved. Finally, she said when he entered. I've been dying to celebrate properly. No more funeral arrangements, no more pretending to grieve. Just us. Just us, he agreed, pulling her close. God, I've missed this. Missed being able to touch you without looking over my shoulder. To freedom. Sable raised her glass. They toasted and drank, settling onto the expensive couch. "Did you hear what the board is planning?" Thaddeus asked. "They want to continue Deborah's charitable projects, maybe even expand them, using her death as motivation for more giving. How noble. How stupid. She's gone. Her vision died with her. But they're so devoted to her memory, they can't see that the smart move is to liquidate everything." Sable laughed. "You can't actually suggest that." "No, but I can quietly sabotage their efforts. A few bad investments here, some mismanaged funds there. Within a year, the foundation will be struggling, and I'll be positioned to help wind it down. Take my cut and disappear." "Our cut," Sable corrected. "Our cut." "Of course." In the bedroom, Lorraine's face had gone from confusion to horror. "That's Thaddeus," she whispered. "But he's there." "Keep watching," Chuck said quietly. "It gets worse." And it did. For the next hour, Thaddeus and Sable dismantled Deborah's life with casual cruelty, laughing about how trusting she'd been, mocking her speeches, planning how to dismantle everything she'd built. "You know what the best part is?" Thaddeus said. "She died thinking I loved her. Died believing in us. She never knew, never suspected. Did you ever feel guilty?" "Why would I? She had more money than she could ever spend. I was just reallocating resources. The board members were recording everything. The journalists were taking notes. Lorraine was crying, but not from grief anymore, from fury. And Deborah, watching from her hidden position, felt the last pieces of her old life falling away. That woman was dead. Actually dead, not just performatively. What remained was something harder, colder, more dangerous. "It's time," Chuck said softly. Deborah nodded. She took one last breath as a ghost, then opened the door. Chapter 9. The Ghost Returns. The apartment door swung wide with the force of resurrection, and Deborah Bond walked through it like a woman returning from war. The effect was immediate and absolute. Thaddeus's champagne glass slipped from his fingers, shattering across the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and bubbles that seemed to echo in the sudden, suffocating silence. Sable made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a scream, scrambling backward on the couch as if distance could make the impossible less real, as if she could rewind time by putting furniture between herself and the ghost standing in the doorway. "Hello, husband," Deborah said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence like a blade through silk. Each word precise, each syllable weighted with the fury of a woman who'd spent a week listening to her own eulogy. "Sorry I missed my own funeral. I had something more important to attend. My resurrection." The word hung in the air like smoke, like a curse, like a promise of reckoning. Thaddeus's face cycled through emotions too fast to name, each one flickering across his features like channels changing on a television. Shock, confusion, disbelief, a desperate hope that this was some kind of nightmare, some stress-induced hallucination brought on by guilt he didn't actually feel. Then understanding crashed over him like cold water, and with it came fear so profound it drained the color from his skin. "You're dead," he whispered. "You died." The doctor said. The doctor lied. I paid him too, along with the funeral director, the coroner, everyone who signed documents saying I was gone. She moved deeper into the room, and behind her, the bedroom door opened. Lorraine emerged first, her face a storm of relief and rage, then the board members, then the journalists' cameras openly recording, and finally Chuck, who positioned himself beside Deborah like a soldier standing with his commander. The bedroom had been full of witnesses, all of them watching, all of them recording, all of them seeing exactly what kind of man Thaddeus Bond was when he thought his wife was safely dead and buried. "What is this?" Thaddeus was backing toward the window as if he could escape through glass and gravity. His eyes darted around the room, cataloguing exits, calculating escape routes, his mind racing to find some way out of this trap. "What kind of sick game?" "Game." Deborah laughed, cold and bright. You think this is a game? You spent 5 years playing games with my life. I spent 1 week showing you exactly who you are when you think no one's watching." Sable was on her feet, edging toward the door. But Chuck moved to block her path. "Stay," he said quietly. "You'll want to hear this." "You can't keep us here," Sable said, her voice shaking. "It's justice." Lorraine cut her off, moving toward her sister. "Deborah, oh my God, you're alive." She grabbed Deborah in an embrace. "I mourned you. I cried for days. How could you do that to me?" "I'm sorry," Deborah said. "I'm so sorry. But I had to see the truth." "And now you do?" "Now I do." Lorraine pulled back, turning to face Thaddeus with contempt. "You celebrated her death. You toasted it. You're disgusting. This is entrapment," Thaddeus said, his voice gaining strength. "Whatever you recorded here, it's inadmissible." "Actually," one of the board members spoke up, "we can. You were caught on camera in your own apartment, engaging in fraud and conspiracy." One of the journalists stepped forward. "Mr. Bond, would you care to comment on your relationship with Ms. Hartwell? On your celebration of your wife's death?" "No comment. I'm not saying anything without a lawyer." "Too late," Chuck said, pulling out his phone. "You already said everything that matters. And it's not just about infidelity. It's about the $20 million you stole over 5 years. The shell corporations, the fake investments, the forged signatures. You didn't just cheat on your wife, Thaddeus. You robbed her." Thaddeus's face went gray. "You can't prove that." "Actually, I can. I've had your accounts audited, every transfer tracked, every theft documented. Who the hell are you?" Thaddeus demanded, turning on Chuck with desperate fury. "You're supposed to be a servant. How do you have access to financial audits?" Chuck smiled. "My name is Charles Remington Robbins. Maybe you've heard of me. I founded Robbins Tech Systems. Sold it for an amount that makes your stolen millions look like pocket change. Then I spent 3 years working as your wife's estate manager because I fell in love with her philosophy, her kindness, her integrity." "You're insane. Both of you are insane." "Probably," Deborah agreed. "But we're insane with evidence, with witnesses, with documentation that'll hold up in any court." "So here's what's going to happen, Thaddeus. You're going to leave. You're going to hire the best lawyer you can find. And then you're going to face prosecution for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. And the prenup." His voice was desperate. "I'm still entitled, except I'm not dead. Which means the death clause doesn't apply. Which means you get exactly nothing." Thaddeus looked around the room, at the faces watching him with contempt, at his mistress backing away, at the journalists recording everything. "Deborah, please," he tried one last time. "We can work this out." No, the word was final. "We can't, because there is no we. There never was." She turned to Chuck. "Get him out of here. Make sure security escorts him off the property. And file the restraining order." "With pleasure." 2 security guards entered. Thaddeus tried one more time to speak, but the guards took his arms and led him toward the door. As he passed Deborah, he stopped. "I did love you," he said quietly. "At first, before everything else. I did love you." She looked at him with eyes that held no warmth. "No," she said. "You loved what I represented. You loved my money and my trust. But you never loved me, because love doesn't steal, love doesn't betray, and love doesn't celebrate death." He left without another word. Sable tried to follow, but Deborah stopped her. "Not yet. You and I need to talk. I have nothing to say to you." "Then listen. You thought you'd won a prize. But let me tell you what you actually won. Nothing. Thaddeus is broke. His assets are frozen. His reputation is destroyed. And you, the luxury consultant who trades in image, just got caught on camera celebrating a woman's death. How's your business going to survive that?" Sable's face crumpled. "I didn't know. I didn't know he was stealing. Maybe, maybe not. But you knew he was married. So here's your choice. Cooperate with the investigation, testify about what you know, and maybe salvage some shred of your reputation. Or fight us and go down with his sinking ship. What do you want me to say?" "The truth. Just the truth. When it goes to trial, tell them everything." Sable nodded slowly. "I'll cooperate." "Good, now leave. And Ms. Hartwell? Find better men." After Sable left, the apartment fell silent. The journalists were already on their phones. The board members were discussing legal strategies. Lorraine pulled Deborah aside. "I'm so angry with you. You let me grieve." "I know. And I'm sorry, but I'm also proud of you. You're stronger than I gave you credit for." "I had to be." "And him." Lorraine glanced at Chuck, "the mysterious billionaire estate manager who's been in love with you. What are you going to do about him?" "Me? I don't know yet. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough. But Deborah, whatever you decide, make sure it's what you want. You deserve that much." Deborah hugged her sister tight. "Thank you. For being here. For not hating me. Oh, I hate you a little, but I love you more." The room slowly emptied until it was just Deborah and Chuck standing in the apartment where her husband had celebrated her death. "How do you feel?" Chuck asked. "Strange, powerful, exhausted, alive." She moved to the window. "Tomorrow this will be everywhere. I'll be famous for all the wrong reasons, or all the right ones. You'll be the woman who refused to be a victim, who fought back." She turned to face him. "And you? What happens to you now?" "I go back to being invisible, probably. Though I might keep the estate manager job if it's still available." "Chuck," she crossed the distance between them, "you saved my life. Not just from Thaddeus, but from myself. How do I thank you for that?" "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do. A week ago, you asked me to ask you again how I see you." She reached up, touching his face gently. "I'm asking now." "Chuck, Charles, whoever you choose to be. I see you. I see someone who loved me when I was blind to everything. Someone who burned down his own life to protect mine. Someone who showed me that resurrection requires dying first. And his voice was barely a whisper, and I don't know what this is. Don't know if it's gratitude or attraction or something deeper. But I want to find out. I want time to figure out who I am without Thaddeus defining me. And then, when I know myself again, I want to see if there's space for someone who's been seeing me all along." Chuck smiled. "I can wait. I've gotten good at waiting. Don't wait too long. I've discovered I'm rather impatient when I'm not busy being dead." They stood in the ruined apartment, two people who'd orchestrated resurrection together, and laughed. Not from joy exactly, but from relief, from survival. Tomorrow the world would know what Thaddeus Bond had done, but tonight she was simply alive, standing with someone who'd seen her when she was invisible to herself. "Come on," Chuck said, offering his hand. "Let's get you home." She took his hand, and they walked out together, leaving behind the champagne and the broken glass and the ghost of the woman she used to be. Tomorrow would bring chaos. But tonight Deborah Bond was alive, awake, and finally free. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The story broke at dawn, exploding across every news outlet simultaneously. "Billionaire fakes death to expose cheating husband," screamed one headline. "Woman rises from grave. Catches husband celebrating," announced another. Deborah watched the coverage from Chuck's apartment, coffee in hand, as her story spread like wildfire. The video clips were everywhere. Thaddeus toasting her death, Sable laughing. The moment she'd walked through that door, alive and unbroken, within hours, the response was seismic. Board members from every organization Thaddeus had been associated with issued statements distancing themselves. Social clubs revoked his membership. Charities returned his donations. His world was collapsing in real time. "Good," Deborah said quietly. "Let him feel what it's like to have everything stripped away." Chuck sat beside her. "The prosecutor's office just announced formal charges. Fraud, embezzlement, forgery. They're pushing for maximum sentences." "How long? If convicted on all counts?" 10 to 15 years. Plus restitution of everything he stole, so he'll be broke and imprisoned. Yes, Deborah should have felt triumphant, but instead she just felt tired. Tired of anger, tired of revenge, tired of looking backward. "I want to make a statement," she said suddenly. "Not through lawyers. Directly to the cameras." "When?" "Today, now." An hour later, Deborah stood before cameras wearing white again. Behind her stood Chuck, beside her Lorraine, I know you have questions, Deborah began. Yes, I faked my death. Yes, it was elaborate and probably cruel to people who genuinely mourned me. For that I apologize, not to my husband, who deserved every moment, but to my sister, to my friends, to everyone who cried real tears. She paused. But I want to explain why. Because it wasn't just about catching an affair. It was about seeing truth. My husband spent 5 years lying to me, stealing from me, planning to abandon me. And I spent 5 years refusing to see it. A journalist raised her hand. So you're saying you suspected something? I'm saying I had opportunities to look closer, and I chose not to. I'm saying I built a prison from my own optimism. I'm saying that sometimes the person hurting you isn't the only one responsible. Do you regret the deception? I regret that it was necessary. But no, I don't regret doing it. Because now I know the truth. Now everyone knows the truth. Another journalist spoke up. What about Charles Robbins? Some people are calling him manipulative. Deborah turned to look at Chuck, then back at the cameras. Chuck saw me when I was invisible to myself. He tried to warn me and I silenced him. He gathered evidence when I refused to look at it. That's not manipulation. That's protection. That's love. Are you saying you're in a relationship with him? I'm saying I'm figuring out who I am without someone else defining me. And I'm saying that when I know myself again, I'll see what kind of relationship is possible with someone who's already seen me clearly. The questions continued for another 30 minutes. When it was over, Deborah felt lighter somehow. That was brave, Chuck said as they walked to the car. That was necessary. I spent 5 years living a lie. I won't spend another day hiding from truth. Over the following weeks, consequences cascaded through Thaddeus's world. Professional connections severed. Financial institutions demanded repayment. His carefully constructed life crumbled into dust. Sable cooperated with prosecutors, providing detailed testimony. Her luxury consulting business survived barely, and Thaddeus, facing overwhelming evidence, eventually accepted a plea deal. 12 years in federal prison. Full restitution of stolen funds. His name would forever be associated with betrayal and spectacular failure. The day his sentencing was announced, Deborah didn't watch the coverage. Instead, she spent the afternoon in her garden, reading a book she'd been meaning to finish. Chuck found her there as the sun began setting. "It's over," he said. "He's been sentenced." 12 years. I know. Lorraine texted me. She closed the book. "How do you feel about it?" "Relieved, satisfied, grateful it's finished. And what happens now?" "For you?" He smiled. "That depends on you. You keep saying that. Because it's true." Deborah set down her book carefully. "Chuck, I've spent the last month figuring out who I am without Thaddeus. And I've learned something important." "What's that?" "I'm stronger than I thought. Braver than I knew. But I've also learned that strength doesn't mean being alone. That I can be whole and complete and still want someone beside me." "Are you saying—" "I'm saying I see you. Finally, completely I see you. Not as my estate manager. Not as my savior. I see Chuck, who sold everything to find meaning. Who fell in love with a speech about purpose. Who waited 3 years for a woman too blind to notice him. She reached for his hand. I see you. And I want to know what happens when two people who've both burned down their old lives try to build something new together." Chuck's expression was unguarded, vulnerable. "You're sure? Because I've loved you for 3 years. That's not something I can just turn off, I'm sure. Not because I'm grateful, though I am. Not because you saved me, though you did. But because when I imagine the future, you're there." He pulled her close, and she let herself be held by someone who'd held space for her long before she knew she needed it. "So, what now?" Chuck asked. "What does Deborah Bond do for an encore?" She laughed. "I have some ideas. The foundation needs restructuring, and I'm thinking about starting something new. A resource for women who've been exploited by partners. That sounds perfect. And you? Are you going back to being invisible?" "No, I think I'm done hiding. You taught me that. You showed me that being seen is worth the vulnerability. Then let's be seen together. Let's build something that matters." They stood, hand in hand, walking back toward the mansion. Behind them, The garden glowed in the last light. Ahead, the future waited. At the door, Deborah paused, turning to Chuck one more time. "You were my servant," she said softly. "But now I know the truth." "What truth?" "You are my savior, not because you rescued me, but because you showed me how to rescue myself." He kissed her then, gentle and sure, and she kissed him back, tasting freedom and truth and new beginnings. 3 months later, they stood together in that same garden, but this time surrounded by friends and family. The autumn leaves had turned to winter snow, and the garden looked transformed, magical, like something from a dream Deborah hadn't dared to have during all those years with Thaddeus. White roses bloomed despite the cold, carefully tended by gardeners who'd worked through the night to create this moment. Candles flickered in glass lanterns hanging from bare branches, casting golden light across snow that glittered like crushed diamonds. The guests numbered perhaps 50, no more, each one chosen carefully, each one real. No society photographers lurked in the bushes. No gossip columnists waited to critique her dress. No distant relatives appeared hoping for inheritance opportunities. Just people who loved her, people who'd mourned her, people who'd celebrated her resurrection not as scandal, but as triumph. Lorraine stood beside Deborah as her maid of honor, tears streaming down her face. "I can't believe you're getting married again so soon." "I'm not getting married again," Deborah corrected, adjusting the simple white dress she'd chosen. Not a traditional gown, nothing with trains or veils or the performance of purity. Just a dress that made her feel beautiful. Just fabric that moved when she moved, that felt like freedom against her skin. "I'm getting married for the first time. Everything before this was just rehearsal. Just me learning what marriage isn't so I could recognize what it is." The ceremony was small, intimate. No grand cathedral, no society photographers, no performance. Just truth, spoken before people who mattered. When the officiant asked if anyone objected, Lorraine laughed through her tears. "I think we've had enough drama for one lifetime." Chuck stood at the altar in a simple suit, no longer hiding who he was. Charles Remington Robbins, billionaire philanthropist and former estate manager, looking at Deborah like she was the only woman in the world worth seeing. "I take you," Deborah said when it was her turn. "Not because you saved me, but because you saw me. Not because you're wealthy, but because you understand that wealth means nothing without purpose. Not because you're perfect, but because you're perfectly honest." "I take you," Chuck replied, "not because you're powerful, but because you're brave enough to be vulnerable. Not because you're wealthy, but because you taught me what wealth is really for. Not because you need me, but because you choose me." They exchanged rings, simple bands, nothing ostentatious, and the officiant pronounced them husband and wife. As they kissed, Deborah thought about the journey that had brought her here. The blindness, the betrayal, the symbolic death, the resurrection, every painful step necessary to become the woman who could stand here now, clear-eyed and unafraid. She thought about the woman in that wedding portrait, the one who'd believed trust was sacred and doubt was poison. That woman had died in Chuck's office when she'd opened a manila folder full of proof. But what had risen in her place was stronger, wiser, more honest about the complexities of love and loyalty. She'd learned that trust without verification wasn't virtue, it was voluntary blindness. That loyalty to someone who betrayed you wasn't admirable, it was self-destructive. That sometimes the kindest thing you could do for yourself was burn down the beautiful lie and build something true in its place. And she'd learned that resurrection wasn't a single moment. It was a choice you made every day, a choice to see clearly, a choice to demand truth, a choice to build your life on solid ground rather than beautiful illusions. The woman she'd been would never have survived what she'd learned about Thaddeus. That woman would have shattered, unable to reconcile the betrayal with her fundamental belief in trust and goodness. But the woman she'd become. She'd orchestrated an elaborate deception, caught her betrayer in the act, and rebuilt her life from ashes. She was stronger now, wiser, more careful, but not cynical, not closed off. She'd learned the difference between trusting blindly and trusting wisely, between faith without evidence and faith built on proof. At the small reception afterward, Lorraine raised a glass. To my sister, who had to die to learn how to live. And to Chuck, the servant who turned out to be a king. To resurrection, Chuck added. To truth, Deborah finished. They toasted and drank, celebrating not an ending but a beginning. Later, as the guests departed and the garden grew quiet, Deborah and Chuck stood alone beneath the stars. Mrs. Robbins, Chuck said, testing the name. I'm keeping Bond professionally, Deborah corrected. But in here, she placed his hand over her heart. In here, I'm yours. You know what's funny? Chuck pulled her close. I spent 3 years as your servant, loving you from a distance, convinced I'd never have this moment. And now I understand why I had to wait. Because the woman I fell in love with 3 years ago wasn't ready for this. She had to break first, had to die and be reborn, had to learn that trust without truth is just pretty blindness. And the woman I am now, the woman you are now, could move mountains, could change the world, could build something that matters with a former servant who loves her for her soul. Deborah laughed, the sound echoing across the snowy garden, the sound of joy, pure and uncomplicated, the sound of someone who'd found their way home after being lost for so long. You were my servant, she whispered, finishing the phrase that had become their truth. But now I know you are my savior, my partner, my husband, my home. They stood in the garden as snow began to fall. Two people who'd orchestrated resurrection and learned that coming back from the dead was less about the dramatic return and more about what you did with your second chance. The guests had left. The candles had been extinguished, and the garden was quiet except for the soft whisper of snow settling on bare branches. In the distance, the mansion glowed with warm light, no longer a prison but a home, a place where truth lived, where love wasn't performance, where two people could be wholly themselves without masks or pretense. You know what I realized today? Deborah said, looking up at the falling snow. Each flake was unique. Perfect in its imperfection, beautiful in its temporary existence. During the vows? What's that? I've never felt this before. This certainty, this peace. With Thaddeus, even on our wedding day, there was this voice in the back of my mind asking if it was real, if he truly meant it, if I was enough. I silenced that voice because I thought doubt was the enemy of love. But it wasn't doubt. It was truth trying to speak. She turned to face Chuck, snow catching in her hair like tiny diamonds. With you, there's no voice, no question, just knowing, just this deep, bone-certain understanding that you see me, all of me, and you're still here. You're still choosing me. Not my money, not my status, not what I represent. Just me, just you, Chuck confirmed. Always just you. I wasted so many years trying to be enough for someone who would never value me. So many years thinking if I just loved harder, trusted more, gave everything I had, he'd finally see me the way I needed to be seen. You were always enough, Chuck said softly. More than enough. He just wasn't capable of seeing it. And you are? I've never seen anything more clearly. Some women are buried before they die, but Deborah Bond had dug herself out, dragged the truth into the light, and shown the world that resurrection was always possible for those brave enough to face what lay in the grave. And as she stood hand in hand with the man who'd loved her through blindness and death and rebirth, she understood something fundamental. The opposite of being buried wasn't being elevated, it was being seen. And finally, beautifully, devastatingly, she was seen. By the right man this time. By her husband. By the servant who became a king.